Welcome to the Plant Grow Reap podcast.
Welcome back to Plant Grow Reap. I'm Andrea McKenna, and today I am joined by Peter Gandolfo and Shane McKenna, both from Aintree Group and both well-experienced directors of family businesses as well as businesses in general. And today we're going to talk about the concept of adopting commercial mindset in family business, but also talking about how family businesses run and what are some of the really important elements of running a family business. And sometimes the little quirks that go along with that, because we obviously know family businesses employ lots of people, but then you've got the original people in the families as well as partners that marry into family businesses, etc. So there's always big conversations to be had. Between the three of us in this room, we have many decades of experience. That's very embarrassing because we are quite on the other end of the spectrum of experience. And some people listening may be at the very start of their careers, so we need to think about that as well. And Shane and Peter have been working with family businesses their whole lives, working with them, advising them, working in them. We are a family business ourselves. And we've all seen firsthand how cultivating strong commercial mindset in family businesses can really drive growth and decision-making and long-term success. But also we've seen the other side of what happens when family businesses don't do things commercially and start to think about how it is that, some family businesses are run like families, aren't they? Yeah. Peter's nodding, going, yes, they are. So, Peter, what is probably in your experience, what have you seen some of the pitfalls that family businesses have done? Because you're a lawyer and you're preparing legal documents for families all the time. What are some of the things that they don't think about when they're starting up their family businesses, but then also that intergenerational change? What are some of the things? And you could probably spend maybe 3 or 4 hours talking about this, but...
Well, I can tell you about one case that'll take that long. And it actually went for about 12 years.
Wow.
In the courts.
Oh, gosh.
So, and it wasn't pretty simply because the family was caught off guard.
Yep.
And it was an intergenerational issue because originally the founders, who were related, who had their children in the business, and the business, that particular one, had hundreds of employees, hadn't thought really about what would happen in the next generation. So the result of that was that there was some documentation required that didn't exist in the beginning. And the court had to provide it.
Right.
And to get the court's permission in that particular case was troublesome.
Okay.
And it involved more than one jurisdiction. It was interstate, different Supreme Courts.
Yep.
And a number of negotiations that were going on with a number of parties having to be represented, including, in fact, strangely enough, one party representing the unborn children.
Wow.
Quite challenging.
Yeah.
So that isn't the way you want to start off.
Yep.
You always need to start off knowing how you're going to end up.
Yep.
And that might be simply continuation through the generations, or it may well be to have a sale of the business at some point that people have decided should happen when certain events occur, triggers. And there's different ways to do it. I mean, there's the example I've given you already has got an opposite example, which is one where it was quite clear that the people weren't able to carry on the business, but they knew that. But it was such a good business they didn't want to surrender it. So then they brought in external people to work with the family members who were not working day to day. So there's ways to do these things, but you've always got to think about them. Up front.
And I think that's what people miss, don't they, Shane? We've seen it all the time. And, even as advisors, we try our best to cover all bases, but families being families, and sometimes the conversations aren't fun. But you don't want to get to the position where Peter's talked about before. So
No. No, and I think one of the key things to think about when you're starting a business, whether it's family or otherwise, is it still has to have the commercial intent. And even though it is family, you still have to treat it as a business and make sure that each person has a clear understanding about what their role is in the business.
Yep.
So some of the things that I've seen where it goes wrong is that you might have children involved in the business and they might have different skill sets and therefore they should be remunerated differently. But because it's family, they might get equal remuneration or might not get remunerated at all and just take profits or whatever the case may be. And that can create dissension between family members because one person might think that I'm doing more than them, but what am I getting out of it on top of for my effort as opposed to that other person. So having those clear understandings about each person's role and treating them as an independent person in that respect in terms of their remuneration and so on is really critical because, we've seen it so many times and Peter nodding his head as well that this is one area where, particularly where there's multiple children or otherwise involved and they're providing different input, it does create dissension.
Yep. And I think it's important to note as well that you may not have any intention of it being a family business when you first set out to start a business, might you? You might think to yourself, it's just me and I'm just going to do it for my job. It's what I'm good at, so I'm going to do it this way. And then all of a sudden, you might have children. They may have an interest in being part of it. You may not have thought about that before either. So particularly if you've got an intergenerational thing where sometimes the family will come on much later on. They will follow in the footsteps. They'll go to university and they'll study to be whatever that is because that's what mum or dad has done. And you haven't thought about it as a family business. And I think it's really important to cover those things with an advisor. And regardless of whether it's a family business or not, there are steps that you have to take to set it up, aren't there? Like you're better off having those conversations than not. And with professional services, with manufacturing, often the family will come into the business, won't they, without you even having thought about it.
Well, that's right. And I'm thinking of a couple at the moment. One of them is I've got a calendar from the business, which is 2021.
Yep.
And that was celebrating its centenary.
Okay.
Now, 104 years now, nearly wasn't because in the third generation, this was a manufacturing business, the third generation, people were quite ill-equipped to deal with it. And so they brought in external advice, which turned out to be poison. And they weren't equipped to read the signs. And the damage that was wrought, again, ended up in the Supreme Court. We had to get a freezing order to take back the money that was stolen. It was significant.
Okay.
And there were so many different ways it was being stolen, lots of tricks. But unfortunately, that generation wasn't commercially savvy enough to be able to appreciate that they'd surrendered. The business is now in the next generation again and going quite well.
Yeah.
But it was a massive, massive whack that they had to cop. So that's one example. But Shane, you'll have others where...
many. I think just to try and pinpoint some of the key things to expand on with that is that you talked about intergenerational. Sometimes you're not going to get the next generation wanting to stay in the business. So one of the key things that we talk about with clients, particularly family-run businesses, is to say it's okay if the next generation doesn't want to take over the business. And so we've got a plan for that. So the succession has to be beyond just the legacy of transferring it to the next generation. Similarly with that, educating the founders, if they're founders or the generation that is controlling the business at that time, that a lot of them, it's about a legacy. And they feel that, and we talk about this, Andrea, when we talk about Aintree Group, that it's our third child. And you have that mentality that you've got to nurture it and then you've got to keep, you're with it forever. But sometimes you have to let go. And you have to look at selling to a third party or otherwise at the end of your career span because the next generation are not equipped to take it over. there's not the right infrastructure, not the right management internally to have someone else externally come in and manage it.
Yeah.
So you're taking like what we call an annuity or a passive shareholding. So you've got to basically prepare for all different circumstances and not just think that this is going to keep rolling over to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. And so having a clear plan and having that succession plan in place is really critical. And then also being transparent with the whole family.
Yep.
Even though you might have situations where some family members are in the business and others aren't. And having that transparency across the whole family is really critical, so everyone knows exactly what the direction is of the business and that wealth transfer, so that can try and mitigate any potential conflicts down the track.
Yeah. We heard a presentation a couple of weeks ago at a seminar that we went to that talked about family business and how most family businesses kind of wing it a little. They may be set up structurally very well. They may have a really good understanding of what their business looks like now. They may not have considered if there's other family members. Probably talking in broader perspective, because this particular session was about what seemed to be well-established family businesses. So maybe a number of generations with a number of family members involved, not just mum and dad who were then looking for succession with their own children, but had gone along a number of pathways. So we've got, probably great-grandparents who have then handed down to what are now grandparents, and then families have joined in, so husbands have come along, a wife here and there, and having to have those conversations and go as far as having a yearly family conference to discuss the issues that are involved. Like, that's the probably broader end where maybe, Peter, you were talking about this situation where, 12 years in court's trying to make a difference. But there's levels, isn't there? Like you can have a small family business where it might just be mum and dad and a couple of kids, or maybe there's an uncle or an auntie or something like that involved as well. What are the most important things of understanding those types of businesses? So we've got a lot of clients who are these, sorts of businesses where it's mum and dad, and it's been handed down to a son, and then, other people get involved. The conversations that you have with those families, what do those things look like from a succession perspective, and from are you legally protected in the long run? Because as Shane has alluded to, Peter, we have Aintree Group and it is our third child, but we have to be realistic about the fact that neither of our children are in professional services, so that will not be handed down to the next generation. That's a hard conversation to have with somebody. Like, your kids are not going to be involved. What do you do now?
Well, I did a little survey of about 20 family businesses, and 9 of them have got to that stage where they say we're ready to sell, or they have sold.
Yep.
Now, interestingly, a couple of them have now realised they're in the business of being in business rather than being in that business.
Yeah.
So the skills that are being passed on from those parents, because we're talking the spouses.
Yep.
In both the cases I'm thinking of, the spouses are actually in different businesses to each other.
Okay.
But they're educating the kids about how to be in business and actually being involved in the businesses that the kids are looking at setting up, or in one case has set up, so that it's actually a family business of being in business.
Yep.
Rather than a family business as such.
Yes.
Yeah.
Across industries, across disciplines.
Yeah.
Across skill
that's
sets.
a really interesting thing, and I don't think many people think about it in that respect, do they?
And in that situation, Peter, is that where they have a management structure separate to the children or the family that basically runs those businesses, and they're just overseeing it as part of the board or whatever it may be?
Well, there've been in one case it was both spouses were CEOs of their respective businesses that they individually founded with other people.
Yep.
But they knew that corporate governance was critical to being able to get out. So when I started advising them, which is at the start of these businesses, questions were, how are you going to get out?
Yep.
And they were coming from me and they were coming from them at the same time.
Yep.
So you'd work that out and then it had come to pass. But then, of course, after that, in that particular case, they were able to look at how they progress things from there with those skills that they developed. In the other case, it's intergenerational. So you've got spouses working together in separate businesses, but setting up this system so that each child the two children have totally different interests. But they know that they've got to repay the family bank out of profits. So it's being funded by the family bank. And they know that they've got to have proper contracts when they lease a building, lease premises, or whether they have other supplier contracts, whatever they are, they're all in place. So the businesses then become ready for due diligence. They're always available to be sold at the right time.
And that's an important point you mentioned during that too, that with succession, particularly if it's going from one generation to the next, how does the generation that's exiting get compensated for the equity that they've put into the business? And it's another conversation that has to be had with the family to ensure that, they're getting just reward for their effort in growing that business or getting it to the point where they're ready to then hand it over to the next generation.
Yeah, so I can now think of farms. And
Classic example.
Examples of it where it works well and where it works really badly. And one of the things we haven't touched on is the emotional cost in a family of things not going well. And we had an example recently where a couple of brothers inherited a farm. They died. Their spouses ended up with the farms, effectively in partnership with each other, and it didn't get on. It didn't go well. And then the next generation, who should have been friendly, same district, same family, weren't. Everything went badly. Whereas in other examples, you can see people have set these things up so that there's a clear delineation, reward for effort, recognition, even surprisingly to the extent that the blokes on the farm, the daughter-in-law is acknowledged in the estate planning because she's the then farmer's wife, and his folks recognise that and reward that effort in a will. So the estate planning's consistent with all the other thinking, and at the same time, the family's looking at how they manage the estate planning for the off-farm children. So that everybody gets respected, their rights are respected, they're in on the conversation. In some cases, they're separately represented by lawyers to make it quite clear that everybody's getting their interests protected. And it's wonderful when you see it in operation. Very important and well worth the effort.
It's a much bigger strategic conversation, isn't it? It's not just how does this happen right now. I think that's it too.
So when's the right time for this, Peter? When's the time to have this conversation? Is it when we're getting close to secession, or is it much earlier than that?
Well, as we might have said before, right at the beginning.
Absolutely.
Right at the beginning. And Shane, you know that, and I know that we have conversations with clients about these things, and you can work it out. 1 out of 3 will get the point. 2 out of 3 won't understand it. So I've now decided I'm not wasting my time with those 2 out of 3 anymore. Why would I? It's the 1 out of 3 that are prepared to get help, and we can help them.
And that's the thing too, that even though it's a family business and it might be a fledgling business to start with, getting the right advice up front or early is critical to make sure all that documentation, the agreements, whatever it might be for that business is sound. And saying, we're just a family business is not an excuse for that, because the key thing with that is you're in business. And the purpose of business is to generate income and wealth and to grow an asset, hopefully. And so therefore making sure that that's done in the appropriate way with the appropriate structures, tax structures, legal structures, etc., is critical up front, so that if something was to happen, heaven forbid, or there is some sort of conflict internally, then we've got those what's the right word, mechanisms or documentation that we can refer back to hopefully mean it's a less challenging transition or remediation that's required, and the family conflict is minimised if there is family conflict.
And I think that's it as well, that family business is inherently family, which means that you've got opinions, you've got everyone involved. There's a lot of emotion, a lot of it is emotion. And if you set it up correctly to begin with, or at the points at which you can make those good decisions, then the emotion is lessened 20 years down the track when there is some sort of secession conversation, or a family member wants to get out, because there's a really good understanding of how that might all happen. And regardless of family business or not family business, those things need to be taken into consideration. And as Peter said, the decisions made early on by the people who make them, who take advice, those decisions make everything easier along the way, don't they? Like, you don't have to.
Yeah, but it may not be early on. It might be where there's a critical event.
Yeah.
So I unwittingly walked into a room with a husband and wife one day to take instructions for their will. And they owned a business. They were both shareholders. They had different shareholdings. There were other shareholders in the business. It was a highly successful business. And I couldn't get them to agree. I couldn't get them to even say what they wanted to agree on or not agree on. This went on for a few conversations over a few years, and in the end it was apparent that they didn't get on.
Yeah, okay.
And they weren't going to get on, and they hadn't got on, and nothing anybody did was going to help them get on.
Yeah.
So they were really going to be going to the family court.
Yeah.
But in the end, they didn't do that. What they did, and they had adult children who were in their own enterprises and conducting their own activities. We sat down and we agreed that there would be a family agreement. So family agreement said you have to have a will.
Yeah.
You have to have a binding financial agreement with your partner, whoever that is.
Yeah.
And in this case, it ended up being both the spouses. So then we had new partners coming in. And you had a shareholders agreement to govern the company and its operations, and who was buying into the company and who was going out, and what happened if a family member wanted to get out of a shareholding. That was all covered. So, and there were external advisors appointed. So an executor, put my hand up, the accountant, an executor, plus family members under the wills and powers of attorney. So the whole thing was being done in a way that was absolutely neutral in terms of any impact. Everything had been damped down, and the business kept going from strength to strength because they'd actually worked out they were wearing different hats. So there's a shareholder, okay, a director, fine, an employee, yes, a spouse, child, or whatever, those hats they recognised and they were prepared to accept who they were. And as soon as they did that, they just take their hats off and put another one on. And the thing is continues to be a very successful business. Now, it could have been in the family court shredded. It could have been just ruined. But they were smart enough to actually get on with it and think about the commercial aspect of the future.
And that's the thing, the commerciality, and trying to take that emotion out of it and look at it on a commercial basis, which is better for everyone in the long run. And that's where emotion, as Andrea said before, can get in the way of these things. And it's, that people have got to take a step back and think about what the consequences are or what the outcome is that they're trying to achieve, and trying to remove the emotion. I know it's easy for me to say that, but trying to remove the emotion as much as you can. But that's where getting external advisors and not just saying, oh, we're a family, we don't need to worry about lawyers, we don't need to worry about accountants, and listening to them about, what we should be doing here. It's really engaging with those people, and it's almost an insurance policy, and also it's what pays for itself basically in terms of making sure we've got a clear understanding and we've got that transparency between the parties, and caters for incoming future people, family members to come into it, so that then they know what they're signing up for or getting involved in up front, because that documentation is all in place.
Yeah. And interestingly, we talk about hats. It's really important for people to appreciate the difference between being a director and a shareholder.
Yes.
Because in the one example where I talked about the family business that's now over 100 years old, they didn't know the difference.
Yeah.
So the corporate governance was something that someone else managed.
Yeah.
And they managed it to such an extent that they sacked the lawyers and the accountants and brought in their own, who then did some things that you wouldn't see in a normal book.
Yep. Yep.
To the detriment of the family. So they're those critical things about understanding governance, principles of governance, and therefore, of course, Shane, relying on advisors to be able to work with the family members, whether they have the same lawyers and accountants as each other or not.
Yeah.
And you always have to manage conflicts.
Correct.
The critical thing is that when you talk about an investment, it's just as vital as it is as building up your brand. It's just as important, because that's the invisible brand.
Absolutely.
What's your culture?
Yep.
What's your governance?
Yeah, and also particularly, again, looking at the end game with succession, and if there's not the next generation to take over the business, having all that documented and having a clear pathway in terms of how you transition to sale or otherwise will enhance the sale price and hopefully alleviate any potential emotion that comes with a sale to a third party.
Yeah.
And the stepping away from the family from a business that they might see as was their legacy. And when I speak to a lot of our clients who are running family businesses, a lot of them are saying that they want this as their legacy. And sometimes if they don't have the right next generation coming through, that's not going to be the case. That's not true. Maybe I should say they're going to have to let go and let someone else take over that legacy, but then they won't have control over it. And that control aspect is something that's really critical that they've got to get their head around as well. Yep.
And easier to do that if the structures are all in place and the conversations are had, either early on or at those critical junctures.
I think the key word there is conversation.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a fellow at the moment. He and his wife have built a brilliant service business. And there's been times when it was subject to being scaled up.
Yep.
And then there have been other times where, for example, where COVID happened, where you say, well, what am I doing? But now what's happened is there's a further conversation going on. And that conversation is enriched by the fact that I've been speaking to that fellow and his accountant has long term.
Yep.
So he's got a great degree of comfort to be able to use us as sounding boards. To test some of these principles so that he feels comfortable and his wife feels comfortable as well, I know, about the direction, even though it was going to go this way and now it's going to go that way. And it may well be that it's not going to be the legacy that was intended originally, but it's going to be something that will work just as well. That's the key. So the strength of that professional relationship is something that he's worked out how to do it and to his benefit. Whereas a lot of people are very solitary in business. Or they're introspective in terms of families. So it all goes on inside the family, but there's nothing external to act as a sounding board. That's the challenge. If it's not there, it's hard.
And that, let's have that as the end point of this conversation, because I just want to ask you about a few things, Peter, with this about having conversations and about relying on an advisor or advisors, depending on what it is. The importance of a conversation at any point, so even if it isn't at the start, because we know someone hasn't walked in the door to Aintree Group Legal and said, Peter, can you give me advice before I start my business? But you might come in, 10 or 15 years later. What is the importance of having a conversation with that incoming client about what they're wanting to achieve in life if they are in a family business, for instance. So you'll sit down with them and you'll talk them through estate planning, you'll talk them through their asset protection and a bunch of other things that are really relevant to whatever stage they may be in their lives. When you talk to them, you hold so much intellectual property about that particular person and all of the 1 million questions that you've asked them in various ways, because you'll talk to them more than once. Nobody's estate plan takes 1 minute to put together. It's ongoing conversations. The fact that if they then have their child come in to have a meeting with you, you have all of that knowledge in your toolkit of what it is that person's talked to you about, maybe 10 years ago even, when you first started to see them. And you can then say, remember when we had this conversation about what you wanted to see your business, whether you'd said to me 10 years ago you want it to be a legacy, whether now you're thinking your child doesn't want to be part of it. Let's enhance that conversation by saying to whoever else is involved in that, we know as advisors what you're trying to achieve in life. It's never just this is a family business and we make money out of it. We've had those deep conversations, haven't we?
Yeah.
Like what
indeed.
they're trying to achieve.
Yeah. And of those 20 that I've mentioned as a little sample, I can tell you that by far the bulk of them, that corporate knowledge is vital.
Yeah.
And how the grandfather talks about the grandchildren, thinks about the grandchildren, describes the way that the grandchildren have approached something over time. Same with the children. You've seen the dynamics at play.
Yeah.
So that is all wonderful as a launching pad for working out how this particular young adult might be approaching something.
Yeah, yeah.
So, example last week where I didn't know the grandfather or know the father. Here's the very mature son, highly experienced, looking at a new venture. The background that I've already got meant that when the son came in and the conversation started, we're already halfway down the track. Already halfway down the track.
Yeah.
So you could speak in a meaningful way and then all of a sudden you've got the confidence, the trust, and it's already there.
Yeah. And I think you probably find that as well, Shane, that, sometimes people will come in and they'll say, it's too expensive to set that structure up. I can't afford to do that, 12 monthly package. I can't really afford to do all of those things. And of course that's going to be the case. And as you said, Peter, 1 out of every 3 conversations will end in, yes, we will take on board with all of that advice taking. When a client comes in and you have an intuitive understanding about what it is that they're trying to achieve, don't you? So particularly in a family business, because you've had those conversations, you've in a lot of circumstances watched children be born, watched them go to university, understand what the family's dynamic is.
I've been to their swimming carnivals and things like that as well.
Yeah,
sometimes.
exactly.
Yes,
you've maybe been involved in the purchase of the holiday house, so you understand the family dynamic in a way that you wouldn't get if you were just going from one advisor to another. So the value of that deep connection with the people that advise you, when in business in general, but in a family business particularly, because you have then come into family circumstances where you can almost be the mediator between people, because
that's right.
You actually have the understanding of what the first person in that conversation was, which is perhaps the mum or the dad or whatever, and they have said to you, this is what I want to leave for my children and grandchildren, where they may not have had that conversation with their children and grandchildren.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, definitely. And I think between Peter and I, we've probably seen everything. Probably not everything, because you never see everything, but we've probably experienced all the different family dynamics and, the positive ones, the negative ones, the in-betweens.
Yeah.
Look, the key thing for me is you listen, and you first of all ask a lot of questions to get a background.
Yeah.
And then you listen. And you listen to their tone when they talk about different family members, and you get it. You then get a sense of what they want, and then also just being straight up open and
honest,
direct with them and saying, is this really what you want? What do you want to get out of this? Why are you doing this? So challenging them as well. So the key thing I always find is that if you're just a yes person and just nodding and listening and saying and just accepting everything they say, then I don't think you're getting the best out of the relationship. And then you're not then giving them the best advice because you're not challenging them and giving them a different perspective, because all you're doing is acknowledging what they're saying and what they think is right. And they're not always right. And our role as advisors is to challenge them and to make sure they're thinking about all the different aspects of it, and particularly when it comes to family business. And we've seen dysfunctional families. It's interesting. I think when there's a lot of money involved, that can taint things as well. And people lose perspective, I think, in that respect. And people can be selfish. They can be over-generous. All different aspects. And so it's just trying to give them all the different perspectives and, as I said, challenging them if you don't think something might necessarily be the right way to go. But at the end of the day, it's their decision. But if we're informing them and giving them every different aspect that they need to think about, then hopefully they come to the right decision in the right way, and it's the best interest for them plus their family.
Well, if that goes wrong, of course, we're always here to litigate.
Let's hope we don't have a lot of family litigation.
That
but
is true. Yeah.
That's the thing, Peter, isn't it? When it all goes wrong, there are options, and we've got to be there. But what is your favourite thing about working with a family business? Not working in Aintree Group as a family business, but when you get to give good advice and when you get to be really part of the journey with a family business, what's your favourite part about it?
Well, it's funny, I've got a number of clients that don't like lawyers. Which is fascinating to hear.
I thought that was a majority of people in general, wasn't it?
But they'll say, I don't like lawyers. My husband doesn't like lawyers, but we work with you. So to me, that's the trust thing,
you're not the typical lawyer, are you?
That's the trust thing.
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
Is. So that's the favourite thing.
I mean, you may have the title of lawyer, but I guess when you're advising them, you're advising them as somebody who cares genuinely about their business rather than you're their lawyer.
That's the
which
thing.
I think is a really important part of it too, Peter, is that when you are just a lawyer, you're ticking the boxes of being a lawyer. But when you're advising a family business, and when you in particular are advising them, you are more than that, because you're invested in what it is that they're trying to achieve as a family, which I think is really important. And I think it goes for the two of you as well, that you both get very heavily invested in what you're doing for clients. I think the fact that, Peter, you've been able to tell us of the stories along the way, which probably are not all recent, are they? Some of them are from...
I've got recent ones which I'm not telling you about.
Well, they're probably...
Because they might breach them.
Yes.
Shane, what about you? What's the most... what do you get out of it as an advisor to family business?
Part of it, for me, that's that trust thing as well that Peter said, but also just knowing that I've contributed to a harmonious family and that the family has got the best outcome collectively. And that and particularly if there's a transition between generations, making sure that the family who is, the part of the family that's transitioning out are getting the best outcome for themselves. And I always say this to them, you've worked hard to get to this point. You've got to then enjoy the spoils of what you've been able to create. So making sure they're in a position where they can enjoy the spoils of what they've created and making sure that it then is in good hands so that they can then not worry about it and enjoy the rest of their life. So making sure we get them to that point is really, really important to me. And also I just love the relationships. I find it stimulating. And, a lot of our clients who we've been dealing with for a long time, they're friends. And I really enjoy that part and the fact that they do trust me and they value what I say. And even if it's not what they ultimately do, they value what I say and they take that into consideration in their decision making.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you both. We could talk about these sorts of things until the cows come home, because there's so much involved in family business and how to run it. We will do a blog post about family business. We'll get Peter's thoughts in that blog post and Shane's thoughts as well. We'll give a bit of a rundown of what we think are the best governance ways to manage a family business, which I think is really useful for people. Even in small family businesses, you can do some things, and we'll put those all in a blog post and share them with our listeners. And if anyone has any questions for Peter or Shane over family business, we're always open to answering questions and having a chat with people. Even if you are not a client of Aintree Groups, we're always willing to have a chat about what your governance looks like and what your family business might look like going forward. So if anyone is interested, please just hop online and have a look at our details. We put all of the details of these conversations in our YouTube links, so have a look at those. And everyone who's been listening today, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Plant Grow Reap. We hope that you found Peter and Shane's insights helpful. There is a lot of information about family business, so we could actually turn it into a podcast series. So if you're interested, please shout out to us about more info and more questions. And tune in next time wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to chatting with you again soon. Thank you both.
Thanks.